The Grand Hall of Velenthar was the largest structure ever built by any species in the known galaxy. A cathedral of living crystal that stretched across 3 kilometers and hummed with the energy of a dying star harnessed beneath its foundations. Tonight it was full. Thousands of beings from dozens of species filled the tiered balconies and floating observation platforms, their bodies shimmering in colors that no human eye could fully process, blues that bled into ultraviolet, reds that pulsed with infrared warmth, and silvers that caught the light of the crystal walls and threw it back like scattered starfire. They had all come for one reason. The rite of convergence had been announced, and Princess Salith Vane Karath, sole heir to the Karath Dominion, one of the 3 most powerful empires in the interstellar concord, was receiving suitors. Salith stood on the central dais, tall and still as a blade, her silver skin glowing faintly in the ambient light of the hall. Her bioluminescent markings, the swirling patterns that ran from her temples down her neck and across her arms, pulsed a calm, steady blue. She wore the traditional armor gown of Valori royalty, a flowing garment of dark metal weave that moved like silk but could stop a plasma round. She was beautiful by the standards of almost every species present, and she knew it, and she did not care. Her father, Dominar Rath Korath, sat on the elevated throne behind her, his massive frame draped in ceremonial warplate, his expression carved from stone. His markings burned a low, warning red, the Valori sign of restrained fury, because he already suspected what his daughter was about to do. The Herald of the Concord, a spindly creature of glass and light, called a Ven, floated to the center of the dais and raised its translucent arms. "Let the rite of convergence begin," it announced, its voice ringing through the hall like a struck bell. "The Princess Salith Vane Korath opens her court to those who would seek union with the Korath Dominion. Let the suitors present themselves." The first to approach was Prince Drethfor of the Khazul hegemony. He was enormous, nearly 3 meters of armored chitin and muscle, his insectoid body gleaming like polished obsidian, his 4 arms folded in the formal posture of Khazul courtship. His compound eyes reflected the light of 1,000 crystal facets as he climbed the steps to the dais with the confidence of a being who had never been told no. "Princess Salith," he said, his voice a deep, resonant buzz that vibrated in the chests of every being in the hall. "I am Drethfor, first brood prince of the hegemony, victor of the scouring of Neth Prime, commander of 12 high fleets. I offer you the military strength of the Khazul, 3 star systems as dowry, a combined fleet of 40,000 warships, and the guarantee that no enemy of the Korath Dominion will survive to see a second sunrise." He paused and tilted his great head, his mandibles clicking in what passed for a Khazul smile. "You would be a worthy addition to my dynasty." A murmur rippled through the hall. It was an impressive offer by any standard, and Drethfor knew it. His posture radiated certainty. Salith looked at him for a long moment, her markings still that calm, unreadable blue. "You speak of me as an addition," she said, her voice clear and unhurried. "You list your victories, your fleets, your territories, all things that belong to you, but you have not once spoken of me as anything other than a strategic acquisition. I am not a system to be annexed, Prince Drethfor." She inclined her head, a gesture of formal respect. "I refuse your suit." The hall went silent, not the quiet of surprise, but the silence of a held breath, the kind of stillness that comes before something breaks. Drethfor's mandibles stopped clicking, his compound eyes darkened, and for a heartbeat, something dangerous flickered behind them. But he was Khazul, and the Khazul did not show weakness in public. He gave a stiff bow and descended the steps without another word. The herald floated forward again. The second suitor may approach. Emissary Yulan of the Thessic Collective drifted up the dais, and drifted was the only word for it. The Thessic were beings of light and thought, their physical forms translucent and shifting, their consciousness distributed across millions of linked minds. Yulan appeared as a vaguely humanoid shape of pale gold energy, its voice coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Princess Salith, Yulan said, and its voice was like wind chimes in a cathedral. The Thessic Collective offers you something no other suitor can, transcendence. Through neural integration, your consciousness would join ours, expanded beyond the limits of a single mind. You would think with the clarity of a billion intellects, see through a billion eyes, and know the universe as it truly is, not as one small being perceives it. Yulan pulsed brighter, as if excited by its own offer. You would never be alone again. Salith's markings flickered, a brief flash of violet, the Vylori sign of unease, but she controlled it quickly. You offer me everything, she said quietly, and in doing so, you offer me nothing. To join your collective is to dissolve, to become a voice in a chorus so vast that no single note can be heard. I do not wish to think with a billion minds, emissary. I wish to think with my own. She paused. I refuse your suit. Another ripple through the hall, louder this time, tinged with shock. 2 refusals in a single right was rare. 2 refusals from a princess whose empire desperately needed allies was unheard of. Behind her, Dominar Korath's markings burned brighter. The third suitor was already ascending the steps, Prince Aelvor of the Sirathan Republic, and he was everything his predecessors were not. Where Drethvor was brute force, and Yulan was cold intellect, Aelvor was charm incarnate. He was serpentine and elegant, his scaled body moving with fluid grace, his golden eyes warm and expressive, his voice smooth as aged wine. He wore robes of woven starlight that probably cost more than a small planet, and he smiled at Salith as if they were the only 2 beings in the universe. My dear princess, he began, and his voice carried the practiced warmth of someone who had rehearsed sincerity until it was indistinguishable from the real thing. I will not bore you with lists of fleets or offers of transcendence. I come to you simply as myself, Aelvor, a prince who has admired you from afar, and who believes that the union of Korath and Sirathan would create something beautiful. He extended a slender scaled hand. I offer you partnership, true partnership, between equals. It was a masterful performance, and the hall responded with appreciative murmurs. Several diplomats nodded approvingly. Even the Dominar leaned forward slightly. But Salith had watched Aevor's eyes during his speech, and she had noticed something. He had looked at the audience more than he had looked at her. Every gesture, every pause, every carefully modulated word had been aimed not at her heart, but at the crowd. He was not courting her, he was performing. Prince Aelvor, she said, and something sharp entered her voice. You speak beautifully, but you speak to the hall, not to me. You say you offer partnership between equals, but a partner looks at the one they are speaking to, not at the audience they are trying to impress. Aelvor's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second, but Salith caught it. I refuse your suit. The hall erupted, not in sound but in movement. 1,000 beings turning to their neighbors, 1,000 whispered conversations, igniting at once, like brushfire across dry grass. 3 refusals. 3 of the galaxy's most powerful suitors dismissed in a single evening. Dominar Korath rose from his throne, his markings blazing crimson, his voice cutting through the noise like a war horn. My daughter has exercised her right under the right, he said, and every word sounded like it was being dragged from his throat against its will. The right of convergence is concluded. The herald repeated the formal closing, but nobody was listening. The story of the night was already spreading through the hall and beyond, racing along communication networks and subspace channels to every corner of the Concord. The Korath princess had refused everyone. In the balconies above, diplomats and spies and merchants argued about what it meant. Was it political strategy? Was it arrogance? Was it the beginning of the Korath Dominion's isolation from the galactic stage? Nobody noticed the human. Captain Ethan Mercer stood near the back of the hall's lowest observation tier, the section reserved for minor species and low-ranking diplomatic staff, holding a data tablet that contained a trade proposal about mineral rights that absolutely nobody was going to read tonight. He wore the plain dark uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps, which looked painfully simple compared to the crystalline armor and woven starlight that surrounded him. He had come to deliver the proposal to a Concord trade official, but the official had waved him off. The right was more important than whatever the humans wanted. So Ethan had stayed and watched. He had watched the princess refuse 3 princes, and he had not gasped or whispered or calculated the political implications. Instead, he had thought, with the quiet, private honesty that humans carried like a second heartbeat, that she looked incredibly lonely standing up there. Not proud, not cold, not difficult, just lonely. He tucked the data tablet under his arm, turned to leave, and in that moment Salith's gaze swept the hall one final time, not looking for admirers or allies, but simply looking, the way someone looks at a room they are tired of being in. Her eyes passed over the high balconies, the floating platforms, the glittering crowds, and then dropped to the lowest tier, where a single human in a plain uniform was walking toward the exit, completely uninterested in the spectacle that had consumed the attention of the entire galaxy. He was not staring at her. He was the only one not staring at her. Salith's bioluminescent markings flickered, just once, just briefly, from blue to a color she had not felt in years. Gold. The lower levels of Velenthar were a different world from the crystal grandeur above. Down here the corridors were narrower, the lighting was harsher, and the air carried the mingled scents of 40 different species cooking, engine grease, and recycled atmosphere that had been breathed too many times. This was where the minor species lived, the ones who had been admitted to the Concord but never truly welcomed, the ones whose embassies were closets and whose trade proposals gathered dust on the desks of officials who would never read them. This was where the humans lived. Earth's diplomatic mission to Velenthar occupied 6 rooms on sublevel 14, a cramped suite wedged between a Brolthy shipping office and a water reclamation plant that hummed loudly enough to rattle the walls at night. The staff consisted of 6 people: Captain Ethan Mercer, 2 junior diplomats, a communications officer, an analyst, and an intern from Brussels who had volunteered for the posting because she thought it sounded exciting and had spent the first 3 weeks crying in the bathroom. Ethan arrived back at the mission after the rite of convergence, tossed his unread trade proposal onto his desk, and stared at the ceiling for a while. "That bad?" asked Lieutenant Priya Okafor, his communications officer, without looking up from their console. "Nobody even looked at it," Ethan said. "Shocking," Priya said flatly. "A galactic ceremony involving the most powerful princess in the Concord, and nobody wanted to talk about our mineral rights proposal. Truly, who could have predicted this?" Ethan smiled, the kind of tired, lopsided smile that came from years of being the least important person in every room he entered. He had been a combat medic before joining the diplomatic corps, 2 tours on Mars during the colony disputes, 3 years of patching up soldiers and civilians in the red dust, learning that the best way to survive was not to be the strongest or the fastest, but to be the one who kept showing up. He had transferred to diplomacy because he believed, perhaps naively, perhaps stubbornly, that talking was better than bleeding. The galaxy so far had not agreed with him. Humanity had been admitted to the Interstellar Concord 11 years ago, and in that time they had achieved almost nothing politically. They were a probationary species, a polite term that meant the real powers tolerated their presence, the way one might tolerate a small insect at a dinner party. Human lifespans were laughably short by galactic standards. Human technology was generations behind, and human psionic ability was non-existent. Most aliens forgot humans existed between conversations. 3 days after the rite, Ethan was walking through the lower market district, a sprawling bazaar that wound through the midsection of Valanthar, like a river of noise and color, when he stopped at a food stall run by a four-armed Bralthi named Gorvash. Gorvash was enormous, orange-skinned, and perpetually annoyed. He sold grilled protein skewers of questionable origin, and he had a well-known policy of charging humans triple the standard price, because in his words, if your species is too stupid to argue, that is not my problem. Ethan ordered 3 skewers. 40 credits, Gorvash grunted. That is very funny, Ethan said pleasantly. The sign behind you says 12 credits for 3. That price is for real customers, Gorvash said, crossing 2 of his arms while using the other 2 to flip skewers. You are human. Humans pay the human price. And what exactly is the human price based on? Based on the fact that you are small, soft, and your species has been here for 11 years and still has not figured out how to negotiate. Ethan leaned against the counter, showing no sign of leaving. All right, here is my counteroffer. I will pay 15 credits, which is 3 more than the listed price, and in exchange I will not stand here for the next hour, telling every customer who walks by that you charge different prices based on species, which I believe violates Section 14 of the Valanthar Market Code. Gorvash stared at him. I do not think you would actually do that. Gorvash, I am a human diplomat. Standing around being ignored while I talk is literally my entire job. I can do it all day. I am professionally trained in being inconvenient. There was a long pause, and then Gorvash made a sound that Ethan had never heard from a Bralthi before. It was a deep, rumbling bark, somewhere between a cough and an earthquake. He was laughing. 15 credits, Gorvash said, shaking his massive head. You are the worst customer I have ever had. Come back tomorrow, and I will charge you 12, like everyone else. Of course, Ethan said, grinning. He took his skewers and turned to find a place to sit, and that was when he saw her. She was standing 10 meters away, half hidden behind a fabric stall, wearing a hooded cloak that covered her silver skin and dampened her bioluminescent markings. But the hood had slipped slightly, and the glow of pale blue light from her temple was unmistakable. Ethan recognized her immediately. He had spent the better part of 3 days trying not to think about the lonely princess on the dais. But he made a decision in that instant, the kind of quick, instinctive decision that combat medics learn to make in the field. He decided not to recognize her. You want a skewer? He called out casually, holding one up. Fair warning, I have no idea what animal this came from, and I have decided that not knowing is better for my mental health. Salith hesitated. She had come to the lower markets to escape from her father's fury, from the political advisors who swarmed her every waking moment, from the suffocating weight of a dynasty that treated her like a chess piece rather than a person. She had not expected to be noticed, and she certainly had not expected to be offered street food by the human she had spotted 3 nights ago. But something about his easy, unguarded manner, the same quality that had caught her attention across the grand hall, made her step forward. What species are you? She asked, keeping her voice neutral, testing whether he would reveal that he knew who she was. Human, he said. Earth. You probably have not heard of it. Small planet, mostly water, very loud neighbors in the solar system. We have been here for 11 years, and our greatest diplomatic achievement so far is that I just got a Bralthi to laugh, which I am pretty sure has never happened before in recorded history. Despite herself, Salith smiled. It was a small smile, barely a flicker, but it was real, and she could not remember the last time she had smiled at something that was not a political performance. They sat on a bench overlooking the market, eating skewers, and they talked, not about politics or alliances or the fate of empires, but about small, ordinary things. Ethan told her about Earth, about oceans so vast you could sail for weeks without seeing land, about mountains that touched the clouds, about cities that never slept, and forests that had been growing since before his species learned to walk upright. He told her about human music, about how his mother used to sing while she cooked, about the way rain sounded on a tin roof at midnight. Salith listened with a stillness that had nothing to do with her royal training, and everything to do with genuine fascination. The Valori lived for centuries. Their culture was ancient, refined, and deeply serious. Nobody talked about the sound of rain. Your species, she said carefully, lives for how long? About 80 to 100 years if we are lucky, Ethan said. That is nothing, she said, and she did not mean it cruelly. It was simply a fact by galactic standards. Most Concord species measured their lives in centuries. The Valori themselves could live for over 1,000 years. A human lifespan was barely a breath. Ethan shrugged. Maybe, he said, but I think that is why we care so much. We do not have centuries to get things right, so every year matters. Every day matters. We love harder, fight harder, and dream bigger because we know the clock is always ticking. You want to know the secret of humanity? We are not brave because we are not afraid of dying. We are brave because we are terrified of dying, and we do things anyway. Salith's markings pulsed, a ripple of gold that she quickly suppressed, pulling her cloak tighter. That is either very wise or very foolish, she said. Probably both, Ethan admitted. That is also very human. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the market flow around them like a river of alien life, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Salith did not feel like a princess, or an heir, or a political asset. She felt like a person sitting next to another person, eating terrible food, and watching the world go by. She did not tell him her name, and he did not ask. When she left, disappearing back into the crowd with her hood drawn low, Ethan sat on the bench for a long time, staring at the place where she had been. Well, he said to nobody in particular, that was probably the most important conversation I will ever have, and she does not even know my name. He finished his skewer, threw away the stick, and walked back to Sublevel 14, where the water reclamation plant hummed through the walls, and the trade proposal still sat unread on his desk. Korath Embassy. Dominar Wraith Korath was receiving a private visitor. Prince Drethvor stood in the Dominar's study, his massive form casting shadows across the war maps that covered every surface. He had come without his retinue, a sign of either respect or threat, depending on how one read Khazul body language. Your daughter insulted me before the entire Concord, Drethvor said, his voice low and controlled. My daughter exercised her right under the right, the Dominar replied, though his markings told a different story. They burned the deep red of a father who was running out of patience. The Nethrak swarm is massing on your border, Drethvor continued. Your fleet is strong, but not strong enough. You need the hegemony's warships, and we both know it. I am offering you survival, Dominar. All I ask in return is what the right should have provided. The Dominar was silent for a long time. I cannot force her, he said finally. The right is sacred. The right is tradition, Drethvor corrected. Survival is sacred. Invite me to remain at your court as an honored guest. Let me make my case to her directly. Over time, she will see reason. The Dominar looked at the war maps, at the red markers that showed the swarm's advancing positions, at the blue markers that showed his own thinning defenses. And he made a calculation that had nothing to do with his daughter's happiness, and everything to do with the survival of billions. "You may stay," he said. When Salith returned to the embassy that night, she found the corridors filled with Khazul guards in ceremonial armor, and her father waiting in the reception hall, with news that Prince Drethvor had been invited to remain at court as an honored guest of the Dominion. Her markings flared white, the Velori sign of cold fury, but she said nothing. The walls were closing in. And somewhere on sublevel 14, a human who did not matter to anyone in the galaxy was falling asleep to the sound of a water reclamation plant, thinking about a woman whose name he did not know, and the way her skin had briefly glowed the color of gold. The Korath embassy on Valenthar was not really an embassy. It was a fortress disguised as a palace, a sprawling complex of dark metal and crystal that occupied an entire district of the station's upper levels. Its corridors were wide enough for Velori warframes to march through shoulder to shoulder, and its walls contained enough shielding to survive a direct orbital bombardment. For the past 2 weeks, those corridors had been shared with Khazul soldiers. Prince Drethvor had settled into the embassy like a conqueror establishing a forward base. His honor guard of 60 warriors occupied the eastern wing, their chitinous bodies clicking and buzzing at all hours, their weapons always visible. They were technically guests, but they moved through the embassy with the casual confidence of beings who knew they were needed. Salith avoided them when she could, and endured them when she could not. She spent her mornings in the War Council with her father, studying the Nethrax threat. The swarm had taken 3 border outposts in the last month, and their advance was accelerating. She spent her afternoons in diplomatic meetings that went nowhere, because every ambassador in the Concord was waiting to see whether she would change her mind about Drethvor. And she spent her evenings alone in her chambers, her markings cycling through colors she did not want anyone to see, blue for calm she did not feel, violet for unease she could not shake, and gold. Brief, involuntary flashes of gold that she pressed down every time they surfaced, because she knew exactly what they meant, and she was not ready to face it. The gold had started 3 days after the market. She had gone back, not to find him, she told herself, just to walk, just to breathe air that did not taste like politics and duty. But he had been there again, at Gorvash's stall, arguing cheerfully about the price of a drink this time. And Gorvash had been laughing again, and something in Salith's chest had shifted, like tectonic plates moving beneath the surface of a world. They talked again, and again, and again. Over the course of 2 weeks, these accidental meetings became something else, not quite planned, not quite unplanned, but understood. Ethan would be at the market in the evening, and Salith would happen to be there too, and they would sit on their bench and watch the crowds, and talk about everything except what was happening in their lives. He told her about human history, the wars, the plagues, the empires that rose and crumbled, the civilizations that burned themselves down and built something new from the ashes. He told her about a species that had nearly destroyed its own planet, and then, with the same stubborn energy, had decided to save it. He told her about music and mathematics, about poetry and physics, about how humans had looked up at the stars for 100,000 years and refused to believe they were unreachable. She told him about the Velori, about their 1,000-year lives and their ancient codes of honor, about the weight of a dynasty that stretched back further than human civilization itself, about the loneliness of being the only heir to a throne she had never asked for. She told him things she had never told anyone, and she did not understand why it was so easy to say them to this fragile, short-lived creature who smelled like recycled air and bad street food. One evening, he taught her a human card game called poker. The entire point, he explained, dealing cards with practiced ease, is to make your opponent believe something that is not true. You can win with the worst hand in the game if you are convincing enough. That sounds like diplomacy, Salith said. It is exactly diplomacy, Ethan agreed. Except in poker, everyone knows they are being lied to, and they enjoy it. In diplomacy, everyone knows they are being lied to, and they pretend they do not. Honestly, poker is more honest. She beat him 4 games out of 5. Valori could read bioelectric signals, which made bluffing nearly impossible. And his exaggerated outrage at losing made her laugh. A real laugh. The kind that made her markings flash gold before she could stop them. He noticed. She knew he noticed. Neither of them said anything about it. But they could not exist in a bubble forever. The collision came at a state dinner, one of the formal events that the Dominar hosted regularly to maintain the appearance of normalcy while the border war escalated. The great dining hall of the Korath embassy was filled with representatives from a dozen species, all pretending to enjoy the food while secretly calculating political angles. Ethan was there because Earth's diplomatic mission had been invited as a courtesy, the kind of invitation extended to minor species, so that the host could demonstrate inclusivity without actually including them in anything important. He sat at the far end of the lowest table, wearing his best uniform, which was still painfully plain compared to the jeweled armor and living fabrics worn by the other guests. Drethvor sat at the high table, next to the Dominar, in the place of honor that should have been reserved for Salith's chosen consort. He had been drinking. Khazul metabolized alcohol differently, and it made them louder rather than slower. And he was holding court, telling war stories to the assembled dignitaries. Salith sat across from him, her markings a carefully controlled neutral blue, her expression polite and empty. The trouble started when Drethvor noticed Ethan. "Is that a human?" Drethvor said, loud enough for the entire hall to hear. He pointed with one of his 4 arms, a gesture that in Khazul culture was deliberately dismissive. I did not know the Dominar invited pets to formal dinners. Laughter rippled through the hall, not from everyone, but from enough. The Khazul warriors laughed the loudest, their buzzing voices filling the space like angry hornets. Ethan looked up from his plate. His expression did not change. "I was invited," he said calmly. "Same as you." "The same?" Drethvor leaned forward, his compound eyes glittering. "You think you are the same as me, human? My species has ruled star systems for 10,000 years. Yours has been in space for less than 2 centuries. You live for, what, 80 years? That is not even a full sleep cycle for a Thesic. You are mayflies playing at civilization, and the only reason the Concord tolerates your presence is because it amuses them to watch you pretend you belong." The hall went quiet, not the fascinated silence of the right, but the uncomfortable silence of people who knew they were witnessing something ugly and did not want to be associated with it. Salith's markings blazed white. She opened her mouth to speak, but Ethan was already standing. He stood slowly, deliberately, the way a man stands when he has decided something important and does not intend to be rushed. He was shorter than every other being at the table, softer, weaker, more fragile, and in that moment, none of it mattered. "Prince Drethvor," Ethan said, his voice steady and clear, "I invoke the Kalvethi." The silence became absolute. Even Drethvor stopped moving, his mandibles frozen mid-click, his forearms suddenly still. Across the hall, diplomats and warriors and scholars turned to stare at the human who had just spoken words that had not been spoken by a minor species in over 800 years. The Kalvethi, the trial of worth, was one of the oldest traditions in the Concord, older even than the rite of convergence. It was a formal challenge, a declaration that one being's claim of superiority over another must be tested and proven. If the challenger endured 3 trials, judged by neutral parties, and was found worthy, the one who had made the claim of superiority must publicly retract it. It was ancient, it was binding, and it was absolutely, terrifyingly real. "You cannot be serious," Drethvor said. "I invoke the Calvethi," Ethan repeated. "Under Article 7 of the Concord's founding charter, any being of any species may challenge a public claim of superiority through the trial of worth. You have declared humans unworthy of standing among galactic civilization. I am challenging that declaration. If I endure the trials, you will retract your words, publicly, formally, and permanently." He paused. "Unless the first brood prince of the causal hegemonies is afraid of a mayfly." Drethvor's eyes burned, literally burned, the bioluminescent fury response of the causal flooding his compound eyes with angry red light. His mandibles spread wide, and a low, threatening buzz filled the hall. But he could not refuse. The Calvethi was sacred law, and to refuse was to admit that his own words had been hollow. Every causal warrior in the hall was watching, and a prince who refused a challenge from a human would never command their respect again. "I accept," Drethvor snarled. "3 trials, and when you break, and you will break, the entire galaxy will see what humans truly are." "That," Ethan said quietly, "is exactly what I am counting on." The hall erupted into chaos, 100 conversations exploding at once, diplomats reaching for communication devices, warriors pounding tables. But Salith heard none of it. She was staring at Ethan, her markings cycling through colors she could not control. White fury, violet fear, and beneath it all, burning like a star behind clouds, gold. After the dinner ended, and the guests dispersed into knots of frantic speculation, Salith found Ethan in a corridor near the embassy's lower exit. He was leaning against the wall, and now that no one important was watching, she could see that his hands were shaking. "Are you insane?" she demanded, and her voice cracked in a way that Valori voices were not supposed to crack. "The Calvethi is not a game. The trials are designed for species that are stronger, faster, and longer lived than you. Warriors have died in the Calvethi, Ethan. Actual warriors, with centuries of training and bodies built for combat." "I know," he said. "Then why? Why would you do this?" He looked at her, and his eyes, ordinary human eyes, brown and unremarkable by galactic standards, held something that she had never seen in the eyes of any prince or emissary or diplomat who had ever stood before her. He was afraid, and he was not hiding it. "Because every human on this station heard what he said tonight," Ethan said. "Every human heard that we are mayflies, that we do not belong, that we are tolerated as a joke. And if I walk away, if I let that stand, then every human who comes after me will hear it too, and they will believe it. I am not doing this for pride, Salith. I am doing this because someone has to stand up, and I am the one who is here." "You could die," she whispered. "I could," he agreed. "But your people measure worth in centuries and star systems. Mine measure it in moments and choices. This is my moment, and this is my choice." She stared at him for a long time, her markings burning gold so brightly that the corridor walls reflected the light. "Then I will be watching," she said, "and if you die, I will make sure the galaxy remembers why." Ethan smiled, that tired, lopsided smile that she had come to know better than she wanted to admit. "That is the most terrifyingly romantic thing anyone has ever said to me." Despite everything, despite the fear, the fury, and the impossible weight of what was coming, she almost laughed. The Calvethi was set for 1 week's time. 3 trials, judged by the Venn Council, broadcast across the entire Concord. The whole galaxy would be watching. No human had ever attempted this. The arena for the first trial was not on Valanthar. It was on Cordon, a high-gravity training world that the Kazul used to harden their warriors. The air was thick and heavy. The gravity was nearly twice the galactic standard, and the ground was a landscape of jagged black rock that stretched to the horizon under a bruised orange sky. Ethan stepped onto the surface and immediately felt his knees buckle. The weight was staggering, not just the gravity pulling at his bones and muscles, but the pressure in his chest, the difficulty of drawing each breath, the sensation that the entire planet was trying to press him into the ground and hold him there. His nose started bleeding within 30 seconds. Drethvor walked beside him as easily as if he were strolling through a garden. The Khazul had evolved on a world nearly as heavy as this one, and his armored body handled the gravity without effort. He glanced at Ethan with something that might have been pity and might have been contempt. "You can surrender at any time," Drethvor said. "No one will blame you. They already expect you to fail." Ethan wiped the blood from his nose with the back of his hand. "Thanks for the encouragement." The trial was simple in concept and brutal in execution. A 40-kilometer endurance course across the surface of Cordan, through canyons and over ridges, with no assistance and no equipment beyond basic survival gear. Completion was all that was required. There was no time limit, no minimum speed, no style points. Just finish. The Vehen judges floated overhead, their crystalline forms recording everything, their observations broadcast live to billions of viewers across the Concord. Drethvor set a punishing pace from the start, his 4 legs churning across the black rock with mechanical efficiency. Within the first kilometer, he was 100 meters ahead. Within the second, he was nearly out of sight. Ethan focused on his feet. Left foot, right foot. Left foot, right foot. The oldest human algorithm. Older than language. Older than fire. His ancestors had crossed continents this way, walking through deserts and over mountains and across frozen wastelands, because the alternative was to lie down and die, and humans had never been very good at lying down. By the 5th kilometer, his legs were burning. By the 10th, his vision was blurring. By the 15th, he fell for the first time, his knee cracking against the black rock, hard enough to split the skin. Blood ran down his shin and mixed with the alien dust. He got up. He fell again at kilometer 18, this time forward onto his hands, his arms shaking so badly they could barely support his weight. The gravity pressed on him like a giant's hand, pushing him down, down, into the rock and the dust and the dark. He got up. The Concord watched, millions of beings on thousands of worlds, most of whom had tuned in expecting to see the human collapse in the first hour and provide a brief moment of entertainment before the real trials began. But the human kept getting up. By kilometer 25, the broadcast had become the most watched event on the Concord's communication networks. Commentators who had been dismissive were now quiet. Analysts who had calculated the exact point at which human physiology would fail were rechecking their models, because the human had passed that point 4 kilometers ago and was still moving. By kilometer 30, Ethan could no longer walk upright. The gravity had compressed his spine to the point where every step sent electric jolts of pain through his body. He hunched forward, his hands on his knees, shuffling like an old man, his breath coming in ragged gasps that left red specks of blood on his lips. By kilometer 35, he was crawling. His hands left bloody prints on the black rock as he dragged himself forward, meter by agonizing meter. His body was screaming at him to stop, every nerve firing desperate signals to his brain that this was wrong, this was damage, this was the body destroying itself. But somewhere beneath the pain and the fear and the crushing weight of an alien world, a voice that sounded like every human who had ever refused to quit was saying the same thing it had always said. Keep going. Drethvor had finished the course hours ago and stood at the end point, watching. His expression had changed. The contempt was gone, replaced by something more complicated, something that the Khazul did not have a word for, because their species had never needed one. The closest translation in human language would be reluctant respect. Ethan crossed the finish line on his hands and knees, his uniform torn, his body broken, blood dripping from his nose and his hands, and a dozen cuts and scrapes that covered him like a map of everything he had endured. The vain judges conferred for exactly 3 seconds. "The human has completed the trial," the lead judge announced. "He passes." The arena was silent, and then, from somewhere in the broadcast audience, someone began to clap. It was a human sound, an earth sound, the simple act of striking hands together to express something that words could not carry. And it spread, picked up by other species who had never made this gesture before, but understood instinctively what it meant. On Valanthar, in the Korath embassy, Salith stood before a view screen with her hands pressed against the glass, and her markings burning so bright with gold that the entire room was bathed in warm light. "He finished," she whispered. The second trial took place 3 days later, in a simulation chamber on Valanthar, a vast room that could project any scenario in perfect sensory detail. The trial was strategy, and the scenario was war. Each contestant commanded a virtual fleet of equal size in a complex tactical simulation with thousands of variables: terrain, supply lines, morale, intelligence, weather, civilian populations, and a dozen other factors that shifted in real time. The judges would evaluate not just who won, but how they thought. Drethvor commanded his fleet with the precision of 10,000 years of Khazul military doctrine. Hierarchical command structure, overwhelming force concentration, systematic elimination of enemy positions. It was elegant and brutal, and devastatingly effective. And within the first hour he had seized control of 60% of the simulated theater. Ethan watched Drethvor's advance on his tactical display, and did something that no Khazul strategist would ever do. He retreated. He pulled his forces back from every contested position, giving up territory freely, allowing Drethvor to advance unopposed. And the commentators called it surrender, and the analysts called it inevitable, and Drethvor himself called it the natural order asserting itself. But Ethan was not retreating. He was redeploying. While Drethvor's forces spread across the expanding territory, Ethan concentrated his fleet into small, mobile strike groups positioned at key supply junctions. He had studied human military history obsessively in the 3 days between trials. Not the grand battles and famous victories, but the guerrilla campaigns, the asymmetric wars, the moments when smaller forces with better ideas had frustrated and confounded larger ones. He struck at Drethvor's supply lines simultaneously from 12 different positions, then vanished before the Khazul could respond. When Drethvor redirected forces to protect his logistics, Ethan hit the positions they had just left. When Drethvor consolidated, Ethan dispersed. When Drethvor dispersed, Ethan concentrated. It was chaos. Deliberate, calculated, infuriating chaos. And it was working. Drethvor could not pin him down because Ethan refused to fight the way the simulation expected. He broke every conventional rule of engagement, used civilian evacuation corridors as feint routes, turned asteroid fields into ambush sites, and at one point sacrificed an entire wing of his fleet as a decoy so that a single ship could deliver a crippling electronic warfare strike against Drethvor's command vessel. The simulation ended in a draw. A draw between the greatest warrior prince of the Khazul hegemony and a human combat medic turned diplomat, who had learned strategy from history books and card games. The Venn judges conferred. Both contestants have demonstrated exceptional strategic ability, the lead judge announced. The result is a tactical draw. The human passes the second trial. In the observation gallery, the Thesic Collective's diplomatic delegation was running probability models on humanity's strategic potential, and the numbers were making them very, very nervous. The third trial was the one that changed everything. It was called the Trial of Spirit, and it was the oldest and least understood of the three. The Venn judges would not explain the parameters in advance. They said only that each contestant would face a scenario designed to reveal the truth of their character. Drethvor went first. He entered the simulation chamber and emerged 40 minutes later, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. He said nothing about what he had experienced. Then it was Ethan's turn. The simulation placed him on a world under attack. A colony of mixed species, thousands of civilians, a city burning under orbital bombardment. He was given command of a small defense force with one objective: reach the enemy command ship and destroy it, ending the attack. The path to the command ship was clear: a direct assault through the city, fast and decisive. The simulated enemy was strong, but beatable if Ethan committed all his forces to the objective. There was one complication. The assault route passed through a civilian district that was still being evacuated. The evacuation was slow, hampered by damage and panic. If Ethan attacked now, his forces would reach the command ship in time. But the battle would sweep through the district, and hundreds of simulated civilians would die in the crossfire. The alternative was to delay the assault, redirect his forces to protect and complete the civilian evacuation first, and then attack the command ship. But by then, the enemy would have reinforced, and the probability of success would drop below 10%. In military terms, it was an unwinnable scenario. Ethan did not hesitate. He ordered every unit to the civilian district. He abandoned the objective entirely, and threw his entire force into protecting the evacuation, shielding the transports, clearing debris, carrying wounded civilians to safety. His soldiers formed a wall between the enemy and the fleeing people, and they held that wall, even as the enemy pressed forward, and the objective slipped further and further out of reach. Period. The simulation ended with the civilians saved, and the command ship still operational. By every measurable metric, Ethan had failed the objective. But the Venn judges were not measuring objectives. When Ethan emerged from the chamber, the lead judge floated before him and said 5 words that would be quoted in every corner of the galaxy for the next 1,000 years. The trial of spirit is past. And then the judge did something unprecedented. It recited the oldest line of the Kalvethi, written in a language so ancient that most species had forgotten it existed. Period. The worth of a being is measured not in what they claim, but in what they sacrifice. Ethan had won the Kalvethi. The hall of Velenthar was full again, as full as it had been for the rite of convergence, but the energy was different. This was not the polished anticipation of a political ceremony. This was the raw, electric atmosphere of a galaxy that had just watched its assumptions collapse. Prince Drethvor stood on the central dais, his massive form rigid, his compound eyes dark. The Venn judges floated beside him, and Ethan Mercer, bruised, bandaged, and wearing the same plain Earth uniform he always wore, stood across from him. By the ancient law of the Kalvethi, the lead judge announced, the challenger has endured all 3 trials and has been found worthy. Prince Drethvor of the Khazul hegemony is required to retract his claim of human inferiority, publicly, formally, and permanently. The hall held its breath. Drethvor looked at Ethan for a long time, and something passed between them that was not quite respect and not quite hatred, but something more complicated, something that acknowledged what had happened without forgiving it. I retract my words, Drethvor said, each syllable forced through clenched mandibles. The human has proven his worth. Then he turned and walked down the steps, his warriors falling in behind him, and the Khazul delegation left the hall without looking back. Above, on the royal balcony, Princess Salif Vane Korath stood where everyone could see her, and she did not try to hide the color of her markings. She was burning gold, all of her, from her temples to her fingertips, a light so bright and warm that the beings nearest to her stepped back in awe. It was the Valori sign of the deepest admiration, and every being in the hall knew exactly who it was for. The war came faster than anyone expected. The Nethrak swarm did not announce their invasion with declarations or ultimatums. They simply appeared. One day, the border outposts were reporting normal activity, and the next day they were gone, swallowed by a tide of biomechanical ships that poured through the frontier like blood from a wound. The swarm was not a civilization in the way the Concord understood the word. They were a hunger-given form, a collective organism that consumed worlds and used their resources to build more of itself. They did not negotiate, because negotiation required the concept of enough, and the swarm had no such concept. Within 72 hours, 4 Korath colony worlds were under siege. Dominar Wraith Korath stood in his war room, watching the tactical displays turn red one by one, and he did the thing he had been avoiding for months. He contacted Prince Drethfor. The communication was brief. "You need my fleet," Drethfor said. It was not a question. "Yes," the Dominar said. "You know my price." The Dominar closed his eyes. When he opened them, his markings were the dull, defeated gray of a Valori who had run out of options. "I will speak to my daughter." He found Salith in the observation tower, staring at the tactical feeds, her markings cycling through colors that told the story of a mind at war with itself. Red fury, white resolve, violet fear, and beneath them all, a stubborn, defiant gold that refused to be extinguished. "The Hegemony's fleet can save our border worlds," the Dominar said. "Drethvor will deploy 40,000 warships within the day, but only if you accept his suit." Salith did not turn from the display. "How many people are on those worlds?" she asked. 3 billion, her father said. "Give or take." The silence stretched between them, father and daughter, monarch and heir, 2 beings who loved each other, and could not find a way to say it, because their culture had spent 10,000 years teaching them that love was a weakness. "No," Salith said. The Dominar's markings flared crimson. 3 billion lives, Salith. "No," she said again, and this time she turned to face him, and her eyes were blazing. "I will not sell myself to save our people, because our people deserve better than a princess who can be bought. I will not teach every girl in the Dominion that her value is measured by who she agrees to marry under threat. We will find another way, or we will fight with what we have and die with our honor intact." "There is no other way," her father said. "There is always another way. A human taught me that." On sublevel 14 of Velenfar, Captain Ethan Mercer was already working. He had seen the swarm coming, not through any military intelligence or psionic foresight, but through the simple, unglamorous work of paying attention. For the past 6 months, while the great powers of the Concord had been focused on the drama of the right and the spectacle of the Kalvethi, Ethan had been doing what humans did best, talking to people. Not the important people, the unimportant ones. He had shared drinks with Bralthi shipping captains who tracked cargo routes through the border regions and noticed that sworn scout ships were testing the perimeter. He had exchanged data with Thessic analysts who were too low-ranking for anyone to listen to, but who had identified patterns in the swarm's movement that suggested a major offensive. He had built relationships with mining guild operators, independent station commanders, refugee coordinators, and a dozen other groups that the great empires treated as background noise. And he had done something else, something that no galactic diplomat had ever thought to do, because no galactic diplomat had ever needed to. He had made friends with the minor species. Not allies, friends. The Gorvon, a peaceful amphibian species with the best sensor technology in the sector, but no military power to protect it. The Kelith, tiny crystalline beings who could interface with any computer system, but who were dismissed as irrelevant because they had no homeworld. The Dreska, nomadic traders whose cargo ships were slow and ugly, but could carry more tonnage than a Kazul battlecruiser. And a dozen others, the forgotten peoples of the Concord, the species that nobody invited to state dinners. Ethan called them all. "I know this is going to sound crazy," he said, and he said it over and over, to every contact he had, in every frequency and language he could manage. But the Korath border is falling, and the big empires are not going to help unless they get what they want. And what they want is wrong. I need ships, not warships, not battlecruisers, just ships. Anything that flies, and anything that can be modified to fight. I need people who are tired of being told they do not matter. And I need them now. The response was not immediate. It came in trickles, and then in streams. A slow gathering of the galactic underclass that no one had ever thought to unite, because no one had ever thought they were worth uniting. The Gorvon sent their sensor platforms, delicate, powerful instruments that could detect swarm bioships at 10 times the range of standard military scanners. The Chelith sent their best hackers, who could crack swarm communication frequencies and feed false signals into their coordination network. The Dreska sent 40 cargo ships, each one hastily fitted with improvised weapons that were ugly and unreliable and absolutely terrifying. And Earth sent everything it had, 6 warships, the entirety of humanity's military presence in the sector, small and outdated by galactic standards, but crewed by men and women who had grown up on the stories of a species that had never once looked at impossible odds and said, "No, that seems like too much." The Coalition of the Overlooked, as the Concord's media would later call it, assembled at the Korath border in a ragged formation that made professional military observers wince. It was not a fleet. It was a collection of mismatched ships, held together by jury-rigged systems and sheer determination. Ethan stood on the bridge of the ESS Defiance, Earth's flagship, a mid-sized frigate that was older than most of its crew, and looked at the tactical display showing the swarm's advance. "This is going to be a mess," Lieutenant Okafor said from the communication station. "We are humans," Ethan said. "Messes are what we do best." The Battle of Korath's Gate began at dawn, or what passed for dawn, in the starless void of the border region. A thin line of light from the nearest star that painted the hulls of the gathered ships in pale gold. The swarm came in a wave, thousands of bioships, each one a living weapon, their organic hulls pulsing with the sick bioluminescence of a hunger that had consumed entire star systems. They moved as one, a coordinated mass of teeth and engines and destruction, and they outnumbered the Coalition by a factor of 20 to 1. The Korath fleet engaged first, their warships forming a defensive line that blazed with plasma fire and railgun rounds, holding the swarm at the border through sheer firepower and desperation. But the line was too thin, and the swarm was too many, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time. The Kazul fleet arrived at the edge of the system, 40,000 warships, the most powerful military force in the sector, and stopped. They held position, waiting, their weapons cold, their engines idle. Drethvor was watching. He would not fight without his price. And then the Coalition attacked. They did not attack like a military fleet. They attacked like a natural disaster. The Dreska cargo ships, loaded with mining explosives, plowed into asteroid fields and detonated them, sending continent-sized rocks tumbling into the swarm's flank. The Gorvan sensor platforms fed targeting data to the Korath gunners, tripling their accuracy overnight. The Chelith hackers tore into the swarm's communication network and flooded it with contradictory signals, turning their coordinated advance into chaos. And Earth's 6 warships did what human warships have always done. They charged straight into the heart of the enemy formation and caused as much havoc as physically possible. The ESS Defiance led the charge, weaving through the swarm's bioships with maneuvers that no tactical computer would have recommended, because no tactical computer could account for the human willingness to try things that should not work. Ethan had no grand strategy. He had instinct, he had desperation, and he had the unshakable human conviction that if you hit something hard enough and fast enough, and from a direction it does not expect, you can break anything. The swarm reeled. Their coordinated assault fractured into a dozen separate engagements as the Kelith hackers disrupted their hive mind signals, and the Dreska asteroid bombardment forced them to redirect biomass to repair damaged ships. It was not enough to win, but it was enough to hold, and it was enough to be seen. Across the Concord, billions of beings watched the battle unfold on their view screens, and saw something they had never seen before. The minor species, the forgotten ones, the overlooked and dismissed and ignored, fighting side by side for a world that was not their own, led by a human who had no power and no fleet and no ancient legacy, only the simple belief that standing together was better than standing alone. Their diplomatic AI calculated the strategic implications of the coalition's success, compared it to the cost of continued isolation, and made a decision that would reshape galactic politics for generations. They deployed their technology platforms to the battle, their advanced systems integrating with the Gorvan sensors and the Chalith hackers to create a network that could predict the swarm's movements before they happened. Then the Sirathan Republic joined, not out of altruism, but because Prince Aelvor understood that the political winds had shifted and he wanted to be on the winning side. Then the smaller powers, one by one, drawn not by treaties or obligations, but by the sight of a ragtag fleet of nobodies, holding the line against an existential threat because a human had asked them to. The swarm broke at the 17th hour of the battle. Their hive mind, fractured by the Chalith's electronic warfare, and battered by the combined firepower of a coalition that should not have existed, lost cohesion and scattered into disorganized clusters that the Korath fleet hunted down, one by one. The border held. Drethvor watched the victory from his command ship, his fleet still unused, his price unpaid, and he understood, with the cold clarity of a warrior who has seen the battlefield shift beneath his feet, that the galaxy had changed while he stood still. He withdrew from the system without a word, and the Khazul hegemony's leverage over the Korath Dominion evaporated like mist in a solar wind. In the aftermath, the Concord did not quite know what to do with humanity. They were not the strongest species, or the most advanced, or the longest lived. They could not match the Khazul in war, the Thessic in technology, or the Velori in psionic power. By every metric the galaxy used to measure worth, they were unremarkable. But they had done something no other species had ever done. They had looked at the beings everyone else had forgotten and said, "You matter," and they had meant it. And in doing so they had built something that all the power and technology and ancient wisdom of the great empires had never managed to create. A coalition based not on power, but on choice. Dominar Wraith Korath found Ethan after the battle, in the medical bay of the ESS Defiance, where he was helping treat wounded crew members, because he was still, at heart, a combat medic who could not watch people hurt without trying to help. The Dominar looked at this small, battered, impossibly stubborn human, and he remembered the warning he had given weeks ago. "You have impressed my daughter. That makes you the most dangerous man in this galaxy." He had been right, but not in the way he had expected. "Captain Mercer," the Dominar said, and for the first time he used Ethan's rank with genuine respect. "I owe you an apology. I told you to leave. I was wrong. You did not just save my border worlds, you showed my daughter something I never could." "What is that?" Ethan asked. "That worth is not something you are born with," the Dominar said. "It is something you choose." 3 days later, on the observation deck of Valanthar, where the great crystal walls opened onto a panorama of stars that stretched across half the galaxy, Salith found Ethan sitting alone. He was bruised, exhausted, and still wearing his battered uniform. There was a bandage on his forehead, and his hands were wrapped from the burns he had gotten when a console on the Defiance had exploded during the battle. He looked exactly like what he was, a fragile, short-lived human who had thrown himself against the impossible and somehow come through the other side. She sat beside him. "The Concorde is calling you a hero," she said. "The Concorde called me a mayfly 3 weeks ago," he said. "I try not to take either too seriously." She smiled, a real smile, wide and unguarded, the kind she had only ever shown him. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "The Calvethi, the battle, the coalition, all of it. You had nothing to gain and everything to lose. Why?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, staring at the stars. "Do you remember what I told you in the market," he said, "about why humans care so much?" "You said it was because you die," she said softly. "It is because we die," he agreed, "and because we know that the things we do while we are alive are the only things that will last after we are gone. I did not fight because I wanted to be a hero. I fought because there were people who needed help, and I was the one who was there. That is all it ever is, Salith. You see someone who needs help, and you help them, and you do not wait for someone more qualified, or more powerful, or more important to do it first, because by the time they get around to it, it might be too late." He looked at her. "And because someone very wise once told me that a princess should not be sold to save her people. And I thought, well, if she can be that brave, then what is my excuse?" Salith's markings ignited. Not just gold, but a deep, radiant, blazing gold that she had never displayed before. A color that in Valori culture meant something so profound that it was only spoken of in the oldest texts. It meant, this one is mine, and I am theirs, and the stars themselves could not change it. She reached out and took his hand, her silver fingers intertwining with his human ones, the warmth of her bioluminescence meeting the warmth of his skin, two completely different kinds of light, creating something new where they touched. "The Concorde will talk about this for 1,000 years, she said. "Maybe in 1,000 years they will finally read my trade proposal." She laughed, and the sound of it, bright and free and unguarded, echoed across the observation deck and out into the stars. The galaxy had offered her princes with armies and empires and centuries of power, and she had refused them all, because power without heart was just noise, and centuries without meaning were just time, and armies without courage were just metal. And then a human had changed everything, not with strength, not with conquest, not with the weight of an ancient dynasty or the promise of 1,000 years, but with the simple, defiant, radiant insistence that every life matters, that every moment counts, and that the measure of a being is not how long they live or how much they conquer, but what they are willing to sacrifice for someone who needs them. Ethan Mercer, combat medic, minor diplomat, professional inconvenience, held the hand of the most powerful princess in the galaxy and looked at the stars, and the stars looked back, and for one brief, perfect human moment, everything was exactly as it should be.